The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 34:18. I perfected the art of silent crying. No one knew I was drowning, until a stranger spoke 4 words that saved my life. If you've ever cried yourself to sleep while everyone thought you were fine, this story is for you. Comment silent if you know what it feels like to suffer alone. My tears have been my food day and night. Psalm 42:3. I learned to cry without making a sound by the time I was 25. It started with small adjustments, pressing my face deeper into the pillow, timing my sobs between my roommate's breathing, keeping tissues hidden under my mattress like contraband. I became an expert at swallowing the sounds that wanted to escape, at keeping my grief so quiet that even I sometimes wondered if it was real. The mornings were the hardest, waking up with swollen eyes and a throat raw from silent screaming, then looking in the mirror and applying concealer not just to the dark circles, but to the evidence of my existence. I'd practice my smile in the reflection, the one that said, "I'm fine," in a dozen different variations. The casual fine for coworkers, the bright fine for family, the exhausted but managing fine for friends who might look too closely. My apartment became a museum of pretending. Dishes I'd wash because someone might visit. Books I'd arrange on the coffee table because they suggested a life of purpose. A journal I'd leave open to positive entries because you never know who might see. But in the spaces no one looked, the medicine cabinet full of sleep aids, the browser history of articles about depression, the phone with 17 unanswered texts, the truth lived like a ghost haunting my carefully constructed normalcy. If you've ever smiled through dinner while dying inside, you'll understand what I'm about to share. I stopped going to church not because I stopped believing in God, but because I couldn't bear the way people asked how I was doing. Their genuine concern felt like bright lights in a migraine. Well-intentioned, but unbearable. I'd sit in the parking lot sometimes, watching families walk into the building with their put-together lives and their children who still believed in simple prayers, and I'd feel like an alien observing a species I used to belong to. Prayer had become impossible. Not because I was angry at God. Anger would have required too much energy. But because I didn't know what to ask for anymore. Healing felt too big, happiness felt too foreign, and hope felt too dangerous. So I stopped asking for anything, stopped believing I deserved anything, stopped expecting anything but the endless gray sameness of getting through one more day. My family called every Sunday, and I'd perform my part in our weekly script. "How are you doing, honey?" "Good, just busy with work." "Are you eating enough?" "Of course, Mom." "You sound tired." "Just staying up too late watching Netflix." The lies came so easily they felt like truth. And maybe that was the most terrifying part. How quickly I'd learned to gaslight my own family into believing I was okay when I wasn't even sure I remembered what okay felt like. I'm going to tell you something I've never said out loud. For 2 years, I thought God had forgotten my name. Work became my hiding place because it was the one area where I could still function. I threw myself into projects with the desperate intensity of someone trying to prove they still existed. I stayed late, took on extra assignments, volunteered for weekend work, anything to avoid the silence of my apartment and the questions I didn't have answers for. My boss praised my dedication, never knowing it was just fear wearing a professional mask. But even there, the cracks showed. I'd excuse myself to cry in bathroom stalls, timing my breakdowns between meetings. I'd stare at my computer screen for hours, reading the same email over and over because my brain felt wrapped in cotton. I'd sit in my car during lunch breaks, not eating, just existing in the only space where I didn't have to perform for anyone. The worst moments came at night, in that space between lying down and falling asleep when all my defenses were too tired to function. That's when the thoughts would come. Not the dramatic, dangerous ones, but the quiet, persistent whispers that said maybe everyone would be better off if I just disappeared. Not died, exactly, but faded away gradually until no one noticed I was gone. These thoughts scared me not because they were violent, but because they felt so reasonable. Drop a heart if you've ever felt invisible to everyone, including God. I started avoiding mirrors except when absolutely necessary, And when I did catch my reflection, I felt like I was looking at a stranger wearing my face. The girl I used to be, the one who laughed easily and believed in happy endings and thought of God as a loving father, had been replaced by someone going through the motions of her life like an understudy who never learned the lines. My phone became both a lifeline and a torture device. I'd scroll through social media, watching other people's highlight reels and feeling like I was viewing life from behind glass. I'd start to type responses to friends' posts, then delete them because I didn't trust my own voice anymore. I had 17 unread text messages from people who cared about me, and I couldn't bring myself to respond to any of them because I didn't know how to explain that I was drowning in plain sight. The isolation became a feedback loop. The longer I stayed hidden, the harder it became to reach out. And the harder it became to reach out, the more convinced I became that I was beyond help. I told myself I was protecting others from my darkness, but really I was protecting myself from their inevitable disappointment when they realized I wasn't the person they thought I was. What I didn't know was that my silence was about to be interrupted in the most unexpected way. Sunday mornings were the loneliest. I'd hear church bells from my bedroom window and remember what it felt like to believe that someone cared about my heart, that my prayers mattered, that I was seen and known and loved not for what I did but for who I was. Those memories felt like artifacts from someone else's life, beautiful but unreachable. I developed rituals to get through the hardest moments, counting backwards from 100 when panic set in, naming 5 things I could see when dissociation threatened, holding ice cubes when emotional numbness felt too dangerous. These weren't tools anyone had taught me. They were survival instincts I'd developed like a wild animal learning to avoid predators. The frightening part wasn't the sadness. Sadness, at least, was feeling something. The frightening part was the growing numbness, the way colors seemed faded, the way music sounded distant, the way even physical pain felt muffled. I was becoming a ghost in my own life, present but not participating, breathing but not living. But somewhere, in a place I couldn't name or access, something was still flickering. When I saw children playing in the park below my apartment, something in me would stir. When I heard laughter from the coffee shop, something would ache. When I caught glimpses of genuine kindness between strangers, something would whisper that maybe, just maybe, the world still held beauty I was too tired to see. Psalm 42:3 became my reality. My tears have been my food day and night. But I was about to learn that God counts every tear. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. Proverbs 13:12. The day I forgot my own birthday was the day I realized I was disappearing. I woke up on March 15th with the same gray heaviness that had become my morning companion, went through my usual routine of concealer and coffee and checking emails, and didn't remember until I was brushing my teeth that night that I had turned 26 that day. The realization hit me like a slap, not because birthdays mattered, but because forgetting your own existence felt like crossing a line I hadn't known existed. I stood in my bathroom, toothbrush in hand, staring at a woman in the mirror who looked like me but felt like a stranger, and laughed. Not the kind of laughter that comes from joy, but the hollow sound that escapes when you've discovered something so absurd it transcends sadness. I had become so good at disappearing that I disappeared from myself. Pause this video if you need a moment. Some pain needs to be acknowledged before it can be healed. The numbness had been building for months, creeping in like fog until I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. Where there used to be sharp edges of pain, now there was just nothing. I stopped crying not because I felt better, but because I'd run out of tears. I stopped feeling anxious not because I'd found peace, but because anxiety requires the energy to care about outcomes, and I was running on empty. Food became a chore I often forgot to do. I'd realize at 8 p.m. that I hadn't eaten since the day before, and even then, I'd stare into my refrigerator without being able to decide what hunger felt like or what might satisfy it. I lost 15 pounds without trying, and when people complimented me on looking so thin, I wanted to tell them it was the weight of not wanting to exist. But instead I smiled and said I'd been eating healthier. My apartment started reflecting my internal state despite my efforts to maintain appearances. Dishes would pile up for days before I'd force myself to clean them. Laundry would sit in baskets, clean but unfolded, because the task of putting clothes away felt insurmountable. Bills would stack up on my counter until the last possible moment. Not because I didn't have money, but because the mental energy required to open envelopes and write checks felt like climbing mountains. Sleep became either impossible or the only thing I could do. I'd lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling while my mind replayed every mistake I'd ever made, every opportunity I'd wasted, every way I'd disappointed people who cared about me. Or I'd sleep for 14 hours straight, trying to escape consciousness, waking up more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed. Type numb if you've ever felt like you were going through the motions of living without actually being alive. Work became a performance I could barely maintain. I'd sit in meetings nodding at appropriate moments while my mind felt wrapped in cotton, unable to focus on words that seemed to come from very far away. I'd stare at my computer screen for hours, reading the same paragraph over and over because my brain refused to process information. Colleagues would ask my opinion and I'd panic, realizing I hadn't been listening, hadn't been present, had been floating somewhere above my own life watching it happen to someone else. The worst part was the anger that would surge up without warning. Not the clean anger that motivates change, but the ugly, irrational rage that comes from being trapped in your own skin. I'd snap at cashiers who were taking too long, feel fury at couples holding hands on the street, want to scream at children whose laughter reminded me that joy was possible for other people. Then the anger would collapse into shame so heavy I could barely breathe, and I'd hate myself for becoming someone I didn't recognize. I stopped answering my phone entirely. The 23 missed calls from my mother felt like accusations, the voicemails from friends like obligations I was too weak to fulfill. I'd listen to them sometimes, hearing the worry in their voices, the genuine love and concern, and I'd feel like I was drowning while people threw me life preservers I was too tired to grab. My spiritual life didn't die dramatically. It just quietly faded like a photograph left in sunlight. I stopped praying not because I was angry at God, but because I didn't have words anymore. I'd open my Bible sometimes, and the verses would look like letters in a foreign language, beautiful but incomprehensible. I'd sit in my car outside churches on Sunday mornings, wanting to go in but feeling like I'd forgotten how to be human enough to sit next to other people. But there were moments, small, almost imperceptible moments, when something inside me would stir. I'd be walking past a park and hear a child laugh with such pure joy that something in my chest would ache with recognition. I'd see an elderly couple holding hands at a crosswalk and feel a faint echo of something that might have been hope. I'd catch a fragment of music from a passing car and remember for just a second what it felt like to believe that beauty existed. These moments scared me because they suggested that underneath all the numbness, some part of me was still alive. And if part of me was still alive, that meant I had to keep trying to live. And trying felt impossible when breathing already required all my strength. I thought I was beyond hope. I didn't know hope was looking for me. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in April. I was standing in line at the grocery store, holding a basket with nothing but instant coffee and frozen dinners, when the woman in front of me turned around. She was maybe 70, with silver hair and the kind of face that looked like it had smiled more than it had frowned. And she looked directly at me with eyes so kind, I almost started crying right there in aisle 9. "Honey," she said, and her voice was gentle like my grandmother's used to be. "I don't know you, but I can see you're carrying something heavy. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." I stared at her, unable to speak, feeling like she'd just reached through all my carefully constructed walls and touched the part of me I'd been hiding from the world. Before I could respond, she squeezed my arm gently and continued through the checkout line, leaving me standing there with tears streaming down my face for the first time in months. That night, for the first time in almost a year, I found myself whispering into the darkness, "God, if you're still there, I don't know how to ask for help, but I'm scared I'm disappearing, and I don't want to disappear." It wasn't much of a prayer, barely more than a whisper, but it was honest in a way I hadn't been with anyone, including myself, in longer than I could remember. And in the silence that followed, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. The faintest suggestion that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I thought. Proverbs 13:12 says, "Hope deferred makes the heart sick." I was about to discover that sometimes God's hope finds us when we've stopped looking for it. You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. Psalm 139:1. The mirror finally broke my denial. What I saw there changed everything. It was a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the grocery store encounter, and I was going through my usual routine of applying concealer to hide the evidence of who I really was. But as I leaned closer to the bathroom mirror, trying to cover the dark circles that had become permanent fixtures under my eyes, something in my reflection stopped me cold. I looked tired. Not just tired, hollow. Like someone had scooped out everything vital and left behind only the shell of a person. My eyes, which people used to say sparkled with life, looked like windows in an abandoned house. My skin was pale not from lack of sun, but from lack of joy. Even my hair seemed to hang limp with the weight of my sadness. When did this happen? I whispered to my reflection, and my voice sounded foreign even to me. I'm about to share the ugliest prayer I ever prayed. But sometimes ugly prayers are the most honest ones. For the first time in months, I let myself really see what I'd become. I wasn't just sad. I was disappearing. I wasn't just struggling. I was dying by degrees, so slowly and quietly that no one, including myself, had noticed how far gone I was. The woman in the mirror looked like someone I might cross the street to avoid. Someone whose sadness was so palpable it made other people uncomfortable. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I grabbed the edge of the bathroom counter, my knees suddenly weak, and felt something crack open inside my chest. Not my heart breaking, but something deeper. The carefully constructed dam I'd built to hold back the flood of everything I'd been refusing to feel. I'm not okay, I said to my reflection, and the words felt like admitting to a crime. I'm not okay, and I haven't been okay for a long time, and I don't know how to be okay anymore. The admission unleashed something I'd been keeping locked away. Anger surged up from a place so deep I'd forgotten it existed. Anger at myself for becoming this person. Anger at the world for continuing to spin while I fell apart. Anger at God for feeling so absent when I needed him most. Where are you? I found myself shouting at the ceiling, my voice raw and desperate. I've been drowning for 2 years, and you've just been watching? I used to believe you cared about every sparrow that falls, but you couldn't be bothered to notice that I was falling apart. If this is hitting close to home, hit that like button. Your support helps this reach someone who needs it tonight. The words poured out of me like poison I'd been carrying in my veins, ugly and bitter and more honest than I'd been with anyone, including myself, in years. I told God about the mornings I'd wished I wouldn't wake up, about the nights I'd counted pills just to see what enough would look like, about the way I'd started to believe that my absence would be a relief to everyone who pretended to love me. I used to think you had a plan for my life, I sobbed, sliding down the bathroom wall until I was sitting on the cold tile floor. I used to believe that verse about you having thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give me a future and a hope. But where's my hope? Where's my future? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you either forgot about me, or you never cared in the first place. The silence that followed my outburst felt different than the silence I'd been living in. This wasn't the empty silence of abandonment. It was the pregnant silence of someone listening, really listening, to words they'd been waiting to hear. Memories started flooding back. Memories I'd buried because they hurt too much to examine. I remembered being 16, sitting in youth group, feeling so close to God I thought I might burst with the joy of being known and loved. I remembered praying with confidence, believing that my prayers mattered, that I mattered. I remembered the night I dedicated my life to serving God, feeling so sure that he had plans to use my story for something beautiful. What happened to that girl? I whispered, thinking of my younger self who believed in miracles and second chances and the power of prayer to change everything. When did I stop believing you could heal me? When did I start believing I was too broken to be loved? This was the moment I stopped pretending and started screaming at God. and he listened. But even as I raged and grieved and accused, something underneath the anger was shifting. The very fact that I was angry meant I still believed, somewhere in the depths of my soul, that God was real enough to be disappointed in. You don't scream at someone you think doesn't exist. You don't demand answers from a void. I thought about the woman in the grocery store, how she'd appeared at the exact moment when I was most invisible, how her words had lodged themselves in my heart like seeds planted in winter soil. I thought about the way I'd found myself praying that night, barely more than a whisper, but prayer nonetheless. "I don't know how to trust you again," I said, my voice hoarse from crying. "I don't know how to believe that you care when everything in my life feels like evidence that you don't. But I don't know how to stop believing either. And I'm so tired of carrying this alone." The admission felt like surrender, not the defeated kind, but the kind that comes when you finally stop fighting a current that's been carrying you somewhere you couldn't see. I pulled myself up from the bathroom floor, looked at my tear-stained, mascara-streaked reflection, and saw something I hadn't seen in months. Someone who was still alive enough to feel, still human enough to hope, still brave enough to rage against the darkness instead of quietly accepting it. "Okay, God," I whispered, and my voice was steadier now, stronger. "I don't understand what you're doing, and I'm not sure I trust you yet. But if you're still there, if you're still listening, I need help. Not just any help. I need you to show me that I'm not forgotten, that my life still has purpose, that this pain isn't the end of my story." I didn't know it then, but that prayer, messy and angry and desperate as it was the beginning of everything changing. Psalm 139 verse 1 says, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me." I was about to discover that being fully known doesn't mean being rejected. "Be still and know that I am God." Psalm 46:10. I wasn't looking for God that Tuesday morning, but he was looking for me. It was raining, one of those steady April rains that makes you want to stay in bed all day. And I was sitting in my car outside the coffee shop where I'd been trying to work up the courage to go inside for 20 minutes. Something about the idea of being around people felt overwhelming, but the alternative was going back to my apartment, where the silence had started to feel dangerous. I'd been in this liminal space for weeks since my bathroom floor breakdown. Not better exactly, but different. Raw in a way that felt both vulnerable and honest. The anger had passed, leaving behind something that felt suspiciously like hope, though I was afraid to name it that. Watch what happens when God uses the most unlikely person to deliver the exact message you need to hear. Finally, I forced myself out of the car and into the coffee shop, ordering a latte I probably wouldn't drink, and finding a corner table where I could sit with my back to the wall and observe without being observed. The familiar anxiety of being in public was manageable today, which felt like progress. I pulled out my laptop, intending to work on a project that was due the next day, but found myself staring at the blank screen, my mind wandering to the conversation I'd had with God in my bathroom. The conversation where I'd demanded answers and gotten only silence in return, or so I thought. The coffee shop was busy with the usual morning crowd. Business people grabbing coffee between meetings, students with textbooks spread across tables, mothers pushing strollers and looking like they needed caffeine more than oxygen. I was people watching to avoid thinking when she walked in. She was maybe 8 years old, with pigtails that bounced when she walked and a backpack covered in unicorn stickers. Her mother was clearly frazzled, juggling a baby carrier, a diaper bag, and trying to manage a toddler who wanted to touch everything within reach. The little girl stood patiently while her mother ordered, and when the barista handed her mother the coffee, she looked up and said something that made the tired woman smile for the first time since they'd walked in. I found myself watching this little girl, drawn by something I couldn't name. She had the kind of unself-conscious joy that children possess before the world teaches them to be careful with their hearts. She was humming while she waited, completely comfortable in her own skin, radiating the kind of peace I could barely remember feeling. Their order was called, and as they gathered their things to leave, the little girl broke away from her mother and walked directly toward my table. My first instinct was panic. I wasn't in any condition to interact with a child, to pretend to be a functional adult when I felt like I was held together with tape and hope. But she stopped right in front of my table, looked at me with the kind of direct gaze that children have before they learn that staring is rude, and said 4 words that would change my life. God says you matter. Comment stranger, if God has ever spoken to you through someone unexpected. I stared at her, unable to process what I'd just heard. Children say strange things all the time. Random, disconnected thoughts that pop into their heads without filter. But there was something about the way she said it, the absolute certainty in her voice, the gentle smile on her face, that made my heart stop. "What did you say?" I whispered, leaning forward. "God says you matter," she repeated, as casually as she might have said the sky was blue or water was wet. "He wanted me to tell you because you forgot." Before I could respond, her mother appeared at her side, clearly embarrassed. "I'm so sorry," she said, gently pulling her daughter away. "Lily, you can't just walk up to strangers and—" "It's okay," I managed to say, though my voice was shaking. "It's okay. She's fine." The mother smiled apologetically and guided Lily toward the door, but not before the little girl turned back to me one more time and waved, her face bright with the kind of joy that comes from delivering good news. I sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours after they left, staring at the spot where she'd stood, playing her words over and over in my mind. God says you matter. He wanted me to tell you because you forgot. How could she have known? How could an 8-year-old girl I'd never met before know exactly what I'd been struggling with for 2 years? How could she have known that mattering, believing I had value, believing my life had purpose, believing I was worth the space I took up in the world, was the exact thing I'd forgotten? This is the moment I realized that God doesn't always speak through burning bushes. Sometimes he speaks through broken people. The rational part of my mind tried to explain it away. Children say random things. It was a coincidence. I was reading too much into an innocent comment from a little girl who probably didn't even understand what she was saying. But my heart knew better. My heart recognized the voice of the God I'd been screaming at just weeks before. The God I'd accused of forgetting about me. The God I'd demanded prove that he still cared. And he'd answered. Not with thunder and lightning, not with a dramatic sign from heaven, but with a child who carried his message like angels used to carry them to shepherds in fields. I drove home in a daze, Lily's words echoing in my mind like a song I couldn't stop humming. For the first time in months, I felt something that wasn't numbness or despair or anger. I felt seen, known, remembered. That night, I did something I hadn't done since I was a child. I got on my knees beside my bed to pray. Not because I thought the position mattered to God, but because it felt like the only posture that matched what was happening in my heart. "Thank you," I whispered. And the words came easier than they had in years. Thank you for sending her. Thank you for not giving up on me when I gave up on myself. Thank you for reminding me that I matter when I forgot. The prayer that followed wasn't eloquent or theological or carefully constructed. It was just honest. The first genuinely honest prayer I'd prayed in years. I told God about the darkness I'd been living in, about the way I'd lost myself, about the fear that I was too broken to be fixed. But I also told him about the hope that was starting to flicker back to life. About the way Lily's words had reached into the deepest part of my despair and pulled me toward light. "I don't understand why you let me get so lost," I prayed. "But I'm starting to understand that maybe I was never as lost as I thought. Maybe you were with me even when I couldn't feel you. Maybe you were speaking even when I couldn't hear you." As I prayed, I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 years. Peace. Not the absence of struggle, not the end of questions, but the deep, settled peace that comes from knowing you're not alone in the darkness, that someone sees you even when you can't see yourself. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." In my stillness, I finally heard him whisper my name. "He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." Psalm 147, verse 3. Healing doesn't look like perfection. It looks like hope, returning one small step at a time. 3 months after my encounter with Lily, I found myself doing something that would have been impossible during my darkest days. I was laughing. Real laughter. The kind that comes from your belly and makes your cheeks hurt, not the hollow performance I'd perfected during my years of hiding. I was having coffee with my friend Sarah, the same Sarah whose texts I'd ignored for months, who'd continued reaching out even when I never responded, who'd waited patiently for me to surface from the depths of my depression like someone watching for a loved one to come home from war. "You look different," she said, studying my face with the careful attention of someone who'd been worried for a long time. "Not just better. Different. Like you're actually here." She was right. I was different. Not healed in the way I'd once imagined healing would look. Not perfect, not problem-free, not immune to sadness or struggle. But present in a way I hadn't been for years. Connected to my own life again. Participating instead of just surviving. The changes had been gradual, almost imperceptible at first. I'd started eating regular meals again, not because someone forced me to, but because I'd remembered that taking care of my body was a way of honoring the life I'd been given. I'd begun answering my phone, returning texts, showing up to plans instead of making excuses. I'd started sleeping normal hours again, my body rediscovering its natural rhythms as my soul found its footing. Watch what happens when you stop waiting for someone else to change and start letting God change you instead. But the most significant change was in my relationship with God. Prayer had become a conversation again instead of a desperate plea for rescue. I'd started reading my Bible, not out of obligation, but out of genuine hunger for the voice that had found me in my darkest moment. The verses that had felt like foreign language during my depression now read like love letters written specifically for my heart. I'd even started going to church again. Not the church of my childhood where everyone knew my family history, but a small community church where I could sit in the back and remember what it felt like to worship with people who understood that brokenness and holiness weren't opposites. It was there, during a Sunday morning service in June, that I had what I can only describe as a full circle moment. The pastor was speaking about the way God uses ordinary people to deliver extraordinary messages, and I found myself thinking about Lily. I'd thought about her often in the months since our encounter, wondering if she remembered what she'd said to me, if she had any idea how profoundly those 4 words had changed my life. "Sometimes," the pastor said, "God's greatest miracles happen not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments when one person allows themselves to be used as his voice in someone's wilderness." I went back to the place where I almost gave up. What I found there proved God wastes nothing. After the service, I drove to the coffee shop where I'd met Lily. I hadn't been back since that day, partly because I was afraid it had all been a figment of my desperate imagination, and partly because some moments are too sacred to risk repeating. But as I sat at the same corner table where I'd received my miracle, I felt overwhelming gratitude wash over me. This was where my healing had begun, where God had reached through my despair and reminded me of my worth. This was where a little girl had been brave enough to deliver a message she probably didn't fully understand to a stranger who needed it more than air. I pulled out my journal and wrote a letter I knew I might never send. "Dear Lily, you probably don't remember me. I'm the sad lady you talked to in the coffee shop a few months ago. You told me that God says I matter, and I wanted you to know that your words saved my life. I don't know how you knew what to say or why you were brave enough to say it, but you were God's voice when I couldn't hear him any other way. I hope someone tells you what a miracle you are." As I was writing, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I looked up to find a woman about my age, her eyes kind but uncertain. "Excuse me," she said. "I hope this doesn't sound weird, but you look familiar. Were you here a few months ago? I think my daughter Lily talked to you." My heart stopped. "That was your daughter?" She smiled and slid into the seat across from me. "I'm Amanda, and yes, that was my Lily. She told me afterward that God had asked her to tell you something important. She's been praying for you ever since." Now when I see someone crying silently, I know what to do. Sometimes we become the stranger God uses. We talked for an hour, and I learned that Lily's words to me hadn't been random at all. Amanda told me that her daughter had always been sensitive to others' emotions, that she often noticed when people were hurting and felt compelled to pray for them. That morning, Lily had seen me sitting alone and told her mother, "That lady is very sad. God wants me to tell her something." She was nervous about approaching you, Amanda said, but she told me that God's voice in her heart was louder than her nervousness. She said he told her you'd forgotten something important and she needed to remind you. I shared my story with Amanda. Carefully, appropriately, but honestly. I told her about the depression, about feeling forgotten and worthless, about how her daughter's 4 words had been the beginning of my journey back to life and faith and hope. We both cried, the good kind of tears that come when you witness God's handiwork up close. "Lily will be so happy to know," Amanda said. "She's been praying every night that God would help the sad lady remember how much he loves her." The encounter felt like grace upon grace. Not only had God used a child to rescue me from despair, but he'd given me the gift of knowing that my healing mattered to her, that my life had been worth her prayers. If this story gave you hope, share it. Someone in your life might be crying silently tonight. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my mother. Not because it was Sunday and she expected it, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to. I wanted to tell her I was okay, really okay, for the first time in years. I wanted to apologize for the months of short answers and deflected questions. I wanted to let her love me again. "Sweetheart," he said when she heard my voice, and I could hear the relief and joy flooding through the phone. "You sound like yourself again." She was right. I did sound like myself. Maybe for the first time in years, I sounded like the person God had created me to be before depression convinced me I was someone else entirely. That evening, I sat on my apartment balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, and I prayed a prayer of gratitude that felt like worship. Thank you for not letting me disappear. Thank you for sending Lily. Thank you for loving me back to life. Thank you for proving that no one is ever too lost to be found. 6 months later, I started volunteering at a crisis helpline. Not because I thought I had all the answers, but because I knew what it felt like to believe you were invisible, and I wanted to be the voice that reminded people they weren't. I wanted to be the stranger God used to deliver messages of hope to people who had forgotten they mattered. The first call I took was from a young woman who sounded exactly like I had during my darkest days. Hollow, exhausted, convinced she was a burden to everyone who claimed to love her. "I don't think I matter to anyone," she whispered through tears. "You matter," I said, and the words carried the weight of my own salvation. "You matter to God, and you matter to me, and I know that might be hard to believe right now, but it's true. Sometimes we forget, but that doesn't make it less true." We talked for 45 minutes, and by the end of the call, she was crying the kind of tears that come when hope starts to flicker back to life. Before she hung up, she said, "Thank you for reminding me. I think I really needed to hear that tonight." As I hung up the phone, I thought about Lily and her courage to deliver God's message to a stranger. I thought about the mysterious ways grace travels from heart to heart, carried by people who are willing to be used by God in ordinary moments. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who cried silently every night, convinced she was forgotten and worthless, and the woman I was becoming. Someone who had learned that healing people heal people, that saved people save people, that sometimes the deepest wounds become the source of the greatest ministry. Psalm 147. 3 promises that He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. I am living proof that He keeps His promises. 5 years after Lily spoke 4 words that saved my life, I stood at a podium in front of 200 people at a mental health awareness conference, sharing my testimony about depression, hope, and the stranger who became God's voice in my wilderness. In the 3rd row sat Amanda and Lily, now 13, and still carrying the same gentle spirit that had compelled her to approach a broken stranger in a coffee shop. After my talk, she came up to me with tears in her eyes. "I remember you," she said. and her voice carried the same certainty it had when she was 8. "I remember what God told me to tell you. I'm so glad you listened." "I'm so glad you were brave enough to say it," I replied, hugging this teenager who had no idea she was my hero. Behind her, a woman approached hesitantly, maybe 35, with the hollow eyes I recognized from my own mirror years ago. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After hearing your story, I think I need help. I've been crying every night for 2 years, and I don't think anyone knows I'm drowning." I took her hands in mine, looked into her eyes, and said the words that had saved my life. "You matter. God sees you, and you're not alone, and we're going to figure this out together." That night, I drove past the coffee shop where it all began, now a place of pilgrimage in my story of redemption. I thought about the mysterious mathematics of grace, how one moment of obedience from a child had rippled out to touch countless lives, how my healing had become a bridge for others to find their own. I thought about all the people sitting alone tonight, crying silently, convinced they're forgotten, wondering if their pain will ever end. I prayed that somewhere, somehow, God would send them their own Lily. A stranger with a message, a friend with perfect timing, a moment of grace disguised as coincidence. My phone buzzed with a text from the woman I'd met after the conference. "I called the helpline you gave me. I think I'm ready to stop crying alone. Thank you for showing me it's possible to heal." I smiled, remembering my own first call to that same helpline 5 years ago, remembering the voice on the other end who had reminded me that I mattered when I couldn't remember it myself. The ripples of grace, I had learned, never stop spreading. From one 8-year-old's courage to one woman's healing, to another's hope, to countless others who would discover that their silent tears were seen by a God who counts them all. "Thank you," I whispered to the God who had pursued me through my darkest valley, who had spoken my name through a child's voice, who had turned my breakdown into breakthrough, and my mess into ministry. Thank you for not letting me disappear. Thank you for proving that no one is ever invisible to you. And thank you for using broken people like me to carry hope to other broken people. Above me, the stars shone bright in the clear night sky, and I could almost hear the echo of a little girl's voice saying the words that had changed everything. "God says you matter." And in that moment, sitting in my car outside the place where my healing began, I knew with absolute certainty that it was true. I mattered. I had always mattered. And so did every person still sitting alone tonight, waiting for their own stranger to remind them of the truth they'd forgotten. The conversation between God and broken hearts, I had discovered, never ends. It just finds new voices to carry the message, new moments to deliver grace, new hearts to heal and send out to heal others. Some prayers change everything. Some strangers carry miracles. Some moments split time into before and after. And sometimes, the 4 words that save your life are spoken by someone who doesn't even know they're performing a miracle. They're just being obedient to the voice of love that sees every tear, knows every name, and never, ever forgets.